So let me begin as we always do at the beginning. Make the land acknowledgement. Acknowledge that we're on Coast Salish territory, the traditional homelands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and other indigenous peoples. I don't see Joel here. I was going to offer him my thanks, or perhaps no thanks, because Act 2 is always difficult to enact, whether you're writing it or whether you're performing it. And so fairly daunting following Joel, but then given the lineup we have with Ray Jonas and Margaret O'Mara next, I'm not sure any slot in that lineup is going to be easy. So the Ganges has been part of my life and imagination ever since I was reborn in India, near Calcutta, close to where several rivers flow into the Bay of Bengal. I was a toddler when my family moved to Delhi, where I grew up, where the Yamuna was close by, the Ganges a little further away. And in the initial stages of my scholarly career, much of my work centered around the city of Patna on the Ganges. And so the image on the left is about the 18th, 19th century world. I used to research. And then on the right, you have on top an image of the Department of History at University of Patna, where I sometimes spend time. In the middle is that terrifying ferry I would have to take to cross into North Bihar. As yet, the Ganges wasn't bridged. And it always scared me because it always happened at night, and I don't swim. And so, and it was a ferry really from an earlier century. And then every once in a while, this very generous local family would take pity on me and other students and take us to the fabled Bankipool Club. And if you know your E.M. Foster and A Passage to India, this is the club the novelist is talking about. Many are the lives of rivers, and many their incarnations. My talk will highlight three avatars, three incarnations of the Ganges. First of all, the river as a goddess. Secondly, as an artery and lifeline in the making of states and empires from ancient times to the colonial period. Vast and extensive time period that I'm going to cover in minutes. So you will see me leapfrogging across centuries every few minutes. And then thirdly, the third incarnation of the river I'll be looking at is that double life the Ganges has today as a sacred waterway, but also as one of the most polluted rivers on earth. It's by far the most polluted waterway in the world. So my presentation would have taken a very different format had I been enticed by these two offers I received earlier in January from one of the best airlines in India, the Indigo Airlines. And what is not spelled out there for someone who may be unfamiliar with what this is about is an invitation to fly to the banks of the Ganges at Prayagraj, which is Allahabad, which is the junction of three rivers, the Ganges, the Yamuna, and a third river known as the Saraswati, which is mythical. Certainly doesn't exist anymore. And even though all this seems very tranquil and soothing and spiritual, what this invitation doesn't talk about is that I would have joined over the 40-some days that this festival is held every 12 years. one of 400 million people expected to be at this festival. That's right, 400 million. Probably my chair would have noticed my absence, but I don't think anyone would have seen me at this on the banks of the Ganges here. The Ganges sprang to life after the mighty Himalayas emerged from a collision between the Indian and Eurasian plates probably 40 to 50 million years ago. It originates in the Gangotri Glacier in the Himalayas, from where it descends southwards into the plains before heading eastwards towards the Bay of Bengal. You heard Joel talk about the length of the Nile River. Well, the Ganges pales in comparison because it's only about 1,500 miles or so, roughly less than half the length of the Nile, and a lot shorter than many of the great rivers that we know all too well. But the Ganges is unique in that no river has been revered by its people for as long as it has been and continues to be worshipped. It's a lot more than a holy river, to cite Joel. She's really a goddess. She is Ganga Mata. She's really Mother Ganga. She's really Ganga Devi or Ganga Goddess. She is said to be the consort of both Vishnu and Shiva, and her waters are said to be the liquid embodiment of Shakti, which is female energy, female strength, as well as the sustaining immortal fluid of mother's milk. And her descent, which you see a description of, one of the stories of how she descended on earth, brings her power and nurturance to the plains of India. This is one of the most celebrated tales about the Ganges. And if you read the second paragraph there, you have sort of a sense of what this story is about, although the backstory to this is a lot more complicated. But if we just go with a mini version here, a certain king wanted to have the Ganges come down to purify the ashes of his 60,000 dead warrior sons. Everything comes in huge amounts, so 400 million people on the banks of the Ganges, 60,000 dead warrior sons. And it was not until many generations later that the great sage Bhagirath, a descendant of that king, went to the Himalayas and succeeded in doing sufficient austerities to the river to come down to earth. But to prevent the force of the flow, because it would have cascaded down and flooded and destroyed everything in the world, the sage also had to do austerities to the god Shiva, so that Shiva would agree to allow the water to pass through his matted locks, which is what you see in the image here on the left, where Shiva sitting on, looks like a tiger skin, with his wife Parvati, and the Bhagirath is imploring him to allow the river to come down. And on the other side are three ascetics. Probably the middle one is famous because he's kept his arm up for eons. So there, and the one that's more recent from the early 20th century is of, again, Shiva with the beautiful goddess Ganges descending, and his wife there seems a little concerned about this maiden coming down on earth. And there, once again, you have this, the sage Bhagirath waiting for the arrival of the Ganges. The Ganges is as many goddesses and as many female figures are, especially if they're the embodiment of abundance and fertility, usually incredibly voluptuous. And here are two sculptures of the goddess Ganga. And I put their place names so you know how far this notion of the Ganga as goddess, how widespread it was and how early on. And nothing shows that better than this very famous sculpture, this huge sculpture done in 7th century in the southern town of Mahabalipuram. And this is from, this was done not only in the 7th century, but this is about 1,500 miles from the north. And Shiva, let's see, Shiva is well, you can't see it very well, but you can see it on the inset on the right-hand side is Shiva. And standing before him is probably some sort of ascetic, or it could be Arjun, because this is known as Arjun's penance, who is either offering his supplication or doing some sort of yogic pose by having his hands above his head. And just so we have animals, or perhaps a cat story in there, at the bottom you see a cat is doing exactly the same thing that the person above is doing. There's no matted locks here because Shiva, presumably at one time there was probably real water going down the front of the statue. So to honor this goddess, to honor this sacred river, you bathe in it anywhere and everywhere, but particularly at certain areas known as crossings of fords. And here when you bathe, you scoop up the water in your hands and then pour it back into the river as an offering to the gods and your departed ancestors. You can also offer the river and the goddess flowers, oil lamps. You also take the water back home for ritual purposes, such as wetting the lips of a person who's dying. Pilgrims bring the ashes of their loved ones to the river, as I did a few years ago, because a Quaker couple I knew who had spent their entire career and life living in India, when they passed away in Massachusetts, they asked that a part of them return to India, to the Ganges. Today, if you want the river, if you want a bit of the Ganges, order it on Amazon. It comes for either $8.99 or $9.99 per bottle. I don't know what's the difference between the two, but of course you can also chant the name of the goddess, and it brings you blessings. The association of the Ganges with ashes and with the dead is epitomized by the extent to which people revere Benares, also known as Varanasi or Kashi, because it is a cremation center and it's a good place to die. Worshippers at the time of death pray that they leave their body on its banks, drinking its waters, rolling in its waters, remembering its name, and gazing upon it. This is one of the reasons why Benares is such a venerated site and a place where you often find a lot of elderly people. And there are certain temples and certain places in the city that are known for sort of being refuges for older people who have no one else to turn to and go there to die. This is what I would have encountered: a helicopter dropping rose petals on the people assembled there, a procession of various kinds of ascetics, and people waiting for that right auspicious moment when you enter the water. And what's fascinating about what seems like utter chaos, how could so many people not be absolute chaos? And there is some chaos, and as you read in the paper, there was already a stampede yesterday, but there is an order that the different ascetic orders follow in going to, marching in procession as well as going to the river. India's rivers, this is sort of part 2 of the talk, have blessed the land in many ways. As with other parts of the world, India's first great civilization emerged on the banks of the Indus River. So notice here on the map, over in the northwest of the Indian subcontinent, many of the key sites of the Indus civilization are in today's Pakistan. And this civilization, which originated probably around 2700, 2600 BCE, and probably stayed very vibrant till about 1900 BC, has left us lots of relics. Some of the foundations of the kind of edifices that existed there, some of the water tanks and other kinds of things that suggest this is a civilization that greatly revered water, and also left us these little steadite seals. The problem with these seals is people have been trying to decipher this script, if that indeed is what is on these seals, since the 1920s. And so far, what we can say with some certainty, I always get this confused, is that it goes from right to left. Or maybe it's left to right. But that's the only thing we know about it. But what's interesting is that there are any number of teams all over the world trying to crack this script. And just recently, the chief minister of one of the southern states of India offered $1 million to anyone who is able to decipher the script. So imagine how little you know about a civilization if you can't read its script, right? This is one of the few great civilizations whose script we can't read. By the way, there's a professor in our computer science department who is part of a group of people, partly based in the US and partly based in India, that are trying to figure out this script. And so far, I think his research suggests, and this is why the chief minister of a South Indian state was very interested to offer a prize to anyone who can crack it, is they believe its greatest affinity is with Dravidian languages. So languages of the South rather than Indo-European or Indo-Aryan languages. From in the late second millennium and the early first millennium, people started migrating eastwards into the Gangetic area. So the northwest is just north and west of Delhi there. And so they started moving into the Gangetic area. And as these people did, they were probably much more nomadic originally. We no longer believe, by the way, that these people that come in invaded, conquered, and defeated the Indus civilization and wiped it out. Rather, it's more groups of people started migrating into these areas. They most likely came from somewhere in Central Asia, somewhere in the Ural Mountains. They are not racially, ethnically to be identified as Indo-Aryan. They're Indo-Aryan because they speak that same family of languages that also gave rise to other languages where Indo-Aryans went. So they started moving in here. They became less nomadic. They started clearing the lands in the Gangetic area. They became more reliant on agriculture, and they shifted from wheat to rice. And in the wet rice cultures of the Gangetic Plains, what this shift of crop meant that you could feed many more people. Rice, in some ways, is much more productive, provides much higher yields. The Ganges was not only critical in irrigation and fertility of this part of North India, but also critical in providing a means of transportation across northern India along an east to west corridor. Eventually, roads are also built, but the river is the most effective way of going east and west. Initially, the society and polity at this time were organized into clans, many under chiefs and kings. This is also a period in which Vedic culture and religion spread across this region. By 600 BCE, towns began emerging across North India. If you'd like, it's sort of a second urbanization that takes place in India, with the first urbanization being in the Indus River Valley. A lot of these polities are also organized as kingdoms, oligarchies, and chiefdoms. So this is the Gangetic Plains, the Gangetic River Basin that people are moving into. And this process of movement will continue for centuries after that, after this period. This is just the beginnings. If you read histories, local histories of many of North India along the Gangetic Plain, in the 16th and 17th century, people are still moving into this area. But this is a very critical phase in how this part of North India is populated. So from these different kinds of people that have moved into this region eventually, and it's interesting that it happens in the part of India that I study. So the empire that will emerge comes out of Mughal, but what's critical about Mughal and where this empire originates is it's along the Ganges. It's based in the city. I used to spend time in Patna, or back then known as Patliputra. And this empire that exists between 321 and 185 BCE extends all the way into the northwest. And so many of the names you can see over in the northwest are left over from when Alexander was here in the 4th century. So they extend the empire all the way into the northwest, creating an empire that really is across the Indo-Gangetic plain, both the Indus and the Ganges, and also into the borderlands, because they are successful in besting many of the generals and many of the people that have been left behind after Alexander left. Alexander, by the way, was interested in getting to the Ganges. The first mention of the Ganges is in the earliest of the Vedas, in the Rig Veda. So 1000 BCE, there's already mention of the Ganges. So it was known. The Ganges, by the way, is also a place Christopher Columbus was looking for off the coast of Panama. He was sure if he just went into the interior, he was about to encounter the Ganges. This part of India also produces the next great empire, the Gupta Empire, whose dates are there between 4th century and 6th century CE. And what is fascinating about these empires is the extent to which they draw a lot of their power and riches from the Gangetic Plain, really the Indo-Gangetic Plain. And the way they are very effective in using the river, not only because it nourishes the land, but also because the river provides it access to all those other parts of India that they conquer. These two empires are also very significant in religious history, because it is in this period that Buddhism arises. This is the Mauryan Empire. The 3rd century of the Mauryan Empire is when the great ruler Ashoka reigned in India, the man who was critical in turning Buddhism into a proselytizing religion and sent missionaries to other parts of Asia to convert people. So some people became Buddhist through Sri Lanka and through the Indian Ocean. Another school of Buddhism went overland and converted people in East Asia, which is why China, Japan, Korea follow a different kind of Buddhism than the people of Southeast Asia. The importance of the river is reflected in coinage of the period. A king hunting animals, and another coin that shows the goddess Ganga standing on, seems like wherever you have rivers, you have crocodiles. I think standing on a crocodile. So as I said, we're going to skip over centuries in a matter of minutes. The Mughal Empire, and really all the kingdoms and empires that emerged from about 5th and 6th century CE to the 12th and 13th centuries, when the first large political systems are set up centered around Delhi, known as the Delhi Sultanate. What they all try to do, but what's different about them is they're not coming from the east the way the Mauryans and Guptans did to conquer other parts of India. They're coming from Central Asia, Middle East, Afghanistan. Many of them are of Afghan and Turkish background, and so they first go to Delhi, and from Delhi, they're trying to capture the regions to the east, the Gangetic Plain, that has so much of the wealth of India. Much, much later, you have the Mughals, whose empire between the early 16th century and 1707, the empire doesn't disappear, it just weakens after 1707. This is the height of the Mughal Empire. You can see, again, they're coming from the northwest and heading to the northeast to control the wealth of the Gangetic Plain. They're also penetrating into the south, and as this map suggests, well before the British are there, the Mughal Empire carves out much of the Indian subcontinent. After them, it's really the British that will control all of the Indian subcontinent. And that is a page that depicts the Emperor Akbar in the middle, and to your right, or to your left, is his son Jahangir, and to the emperor's left is his grandson Shah Jahan, and their various ministers standing before the three emperors. How important is the Ganges? As these two images from various texts show you, the first one is where the second Mughal Emperor Humayun, barely escaping after losing in a battle or fleeing a battle, and he's saved by his water carrier who helps him cross the river as he's drowning. And in the second image is about a very famous battle that took place between Akbar and one of his generals who had refused to turn over some of his wealth, and so Akbar went after him, and much of the battle takes place on the Ganges. So the Ganges is used as a major artery throughout this period. But no one uses the Ganges in quite the way that the British will. And what makes the European presence in India very different than other political powers that had come there before, you can kind of see in these two maps. The one on your left, you're probably surprised that even the Danes were in India, that all these different European companies were trying to trade in India, because India was one of the richest countries on earth, along with China. And so if you wanted its fabulous textiles, you wanted to bring back home what India had to offer, you set up shop, so to speak, in the Indian subcontinent. And because all these are maritime powers, they come to the Indian subcontinent along the coastal area. They are kept in the coastal peripheries of India till the second map there, which shows you about the expansion of British power in India. And as you can see, it's one of the keys to British victory is acquiring the province of Bengal, said to be one of the richest areas in the world, probably had a population of 30 or 40 million in the late 8th century, probably 6 or 7 times the size of England then. And Britain will acquire this province by 1765. It's sort of like getting control of California and getting control of its revenues and taxes collected from the land and taxes collected from transit duties, trade. What enables them to do so is a couple of battles. The first is one fought in the Battle of Plassey. And in this battle, that saw about 3,000 British troops, of whom probably about 2,100 or 2,200 were Indian soldiers, the rest were Europeans, fight against a military that was 50,000 strong. And the British prevail in this battle because they've bribed the Indian ruler's main general. And so his cavalry does not fight. And so this general was promised the crown of the headship of this province if he betrayed his master, which he did. And as soon as he did that, he became a puppet of the British. And the next one, after a second battle that was fought between the British and this time Bengal, as well as another regional power known as Awadh, together with the Mughal emperor, who no longer has the power that his ancestors did until about 1707, signs a treaty in 1765 where he's signing over the right to collect the revenue and taxes of all of Bengal. This is the breakthrough for the British, because the East India Company is no longer forever begging London to send resources. They are making so much money, they're collecting so much money, that not only are its officers going to enjoy a lot of loot that they put into their pockets, but also they now have the resources to create the military to fight against other powers in India. Because with the weakening of the Mughal Empire, India falls into a number of regional kingdoms, and the British or the English East India Company is one of the many regional contenders fighting with all these other forces. Because once they have defeated the French in the 7 Years' War between 1750s and 1760s, they are the most powerful European force on the Indian subcontinent. Along with the military that they control And increasingly, the military will be the ultimate guarantor of British colonial power. They also develop a bureaucracy. They also co-opt local elites and make them brokers and middlemen in ruling. They convert many of the states into princely states where they don't rule them directly as they did the rest of India. Allow them nominally and in name to be rulers, but in effect the British are pulling their strings. What they also do, and this is what makes this empire so powerful over time, even as it has vast gaps, is they start collecting knowledge. It's an empire built on knowledge. It's an empire that has, along with economic, political, military, and social control, intellectual and cultural control of India. And this is as early as 1780s. They have drawn a very detailed map of the course of the Ganges and all the settlements that are on the side of the Ganges, or a map of the entire north part of Hindustan. And there were any number of such schemes, generally using Indians as collaborators to manufacture the knowledge necessary to rule and to command, and of course, to collect taxes. I mean, in part, all this information gathering is also designed to extract more from the pockets of Indians. In a book I wrote about the Gangetic Valley and the trading systems and the marketing systems of Gangetic North India, I pointed out the extent to which the Ganges is used as key artery, but it's also used as a way to wander upstream into India, because as a maritime power, the British come via the ports. They're different than the different Muslim powers and the Mughals who came via land and came from the northwest. So what the British are doing is, as they travel upstream, seems like virtually everybody who ever went anywhere in India would keep a record of what they saw and did. Many of their sites are stereotypes of what Europeans thought of India. So boats, and there were always people that documented the hundreds of different kinds of boats that plied the waters of the Ganges. Illustrations of every form of travel in India. And what is fascinating is, even as they're collecting information, this is really a surveillance project of epic proportions, they are always at a distance from the local population. So on horseback, elephant back, camelback, on the boat, away from, they don't get off and wander into the villages off the banks of the Ganges. They stay at a distance, but everything they see, they chronicle. And seems like every traveler sees some of the same sights, usually exotic things of one sort or another. What did the British consider exotic? Sati, acts of widow immolation, ascetics of various sort, performing austerities or performing various kinds of acts upon themselves, hook swinging, or things that were really bizarre. Because in part, this documentation project is also about underlining the difference in European civilization and Indian cultures that were barbaric. It was a way of putting India into a different time, a past time where the greatness of the civilization lay in its distant past, but in its recent past, it had been mostly barbaric. And so many of the travelers in the 18th and 19th century, many educated people, could draw. And so they're not only scratches on notebooks, but they're also illustrations. They were drawn to festivals. This is one of the festivals I visited, which is held once a year at the junction of rivers near Patna. And what is fascinating, and the reason why I went there, is it's the greatest animal sales fair in the world. I could have returned with an elephant. Those are the kinds of animals sold at this festival. Elephants, camels, horses, you name it. And this became one of the favorite events of the British that lived in this part of North India. Another image. They also used, once photography came in, they were very quick to adapt it for their purposes, photographing not only sites of all sorts, but photographing people. Very early on, they decide one way to distinguish between and among Indians was to photograph them. And they compiled huge dossiers with photographs of Indian people. But then they discovered they really couldn't tell them apart. And so they turned to other kinds of techniques. So India is where fingerprinting is developed. A British officer figures out one way to, everybody has a very distinctive fingerprint mark. And so if you kept albums of fingerprints, you could figure out who the bad guys are from the good guys. And so endless photographs of, and you'll see in a lot of the photographs as well as in the paintings, India always seems in a state of ruin. It's falling apart. It's very different than kind of the pictures of the much more robust scenes from London or Paris or other European capitals. And what you've done is follow me all the way up to the Ganges, to one of the first towns where, when the Ganges enters the plains, goes by. It's also a place where, if you live in Delhi, it's one of the towns that the Ganges skirts that's closest to Delhi. So the lovely place of Hardwar. And much as I hate to end on this note, let me talk about the most polluted river on earth. What makes this polluted is not just human waste, much of it untreated, but waste coming from every factory, every chemical plant is poured into the Ganges. The Ganges is also where the dead are cremated and their bodies are thrown in. During the COVID years, because people didn't have the resources, the wood, the money, many of the bodies were not fully cremated. Not that you really need to know this. It takes about 3 hours to fully cremate someone. And so a lot of the bodies were half burnt and thrown into the Ganges. Its fecal content is probably about 10 to 20 times above the maximum of what the government of India says is an acceptable level to bathe in. Periodically, there are attempts made to clean it up. The government of India has allocated huge sums of money on these cleansing projects, but very little of those funds have been used. So that tells you something about how concerted the efforts have been. Very briefly, there was a lot of joy because of this lawsuit that was filed and won by a petitioner who asked the state of Uttarakhand, and some of you probably know the legal language there of accordingly, while exercising the parents' patri jurisdiction, the rivers, Ganges and Yamuna and all their tributaries, et cetera, declared as legal persons, legal living entities having the status of a legal person with all corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities of a living person. In other words, it was incumbent on the state to protect the life and interests of the river. Needless to say, this case was quickly overturned. Similar kinds of suits have been launched in many parts of the world, from New Zealand to Bangladesh, and it's interesting to follow their outcome. I don't think they've gotten very far, but someday, perhaps we're going to have a Ganges that's going to look like this on a daily basis. Obviously, this is sunset in a very kind of dreamy, romantic light at Ganges. But whether or not the government of India is going to do that with any degree of speed remains to be seen. It has yet to take action, even though it's talked about it a lot of times, and it's something that the present government has been interested in doing. In fact, Prime Minister Modi has at times, in launching his electoral campaign, said that one of his aims is to clean the river. And the Ganges is also of critical importance today because its river basin, where over 400 million people live, is also the Hindi belt, a part of North India where the ruling party gets a lot of its support. So let's hope there will be much more positive incarnations of the River Ganges in the very near future. And let me stop there. Thank you.
That was Professor Anand Yang, who is also formerly the chair of the history department. He's been the director of the Jackson School and author of 4 books, 2 of which have been located very close to the Ganges. I'm Aditya Ramesh. I am an assistant professor of modern South Asian history. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before I also take some questions from the audience. Anand, that was a beautiful talk. I wanted to ask you, so you started with the idea of purity and gods, you ended with pollution, and I was wondering how, in the Indian context, can water bodies be both pure and polluted at the same time? Can you talk a little bit about religion and caste, and how water especially can be both pure and polluted at once?
Yeah, I think one other thing to take into consideration, that if you're a believer, you think the Ganges has special properties that erases any kind of pollution you have. So even though your eyes see human-generated pollution, if you immerse yourself in the water, it has curative powers. And because people believe that, when they're asked about what would you do about the pollution of the river, they have difficulty in these studies that have been done of them of balancing the two. They think that there are certain kinds of bacteriophages in the Ganges that will cure them. And so they continue to bathe even though they admit that it's polluted at some level. So they can juggle both of those ideas. But this idea that the Ganges is water that is pure and pollution in some ways is not a major factor, perhaps is suggested by that a person of any caste can enter the Ganges. So unlike lots of other things, traditionally, that you couldn't do because of your caste background, in the case of the Ganges, that doesn't apply. So it isn't only certain areas of the Ganges, people of other castes, people of certain castes can't go in. So it's in the rituals performed in the Ganges, there's a certain kind of community that's constructed of all of its believers. And so that is why people go to the certain areas of the Ganges. That's why people go to these religious festivals, because they are immersing themselves as part of this larger community of believers.
Thank you so much. There's a question here which asks, how does the Ganges find itself in Indian politics? What are some of the ways in which it plays out in Indian politics? One of the things that you mentioned in your talk was that Allahabad, clearly having certain phonetic connotations, is today Prayagraj. Maybe you can talk about how the Ganges has entered the Indian political imaginary.
I think it's entered the Indian political imagination in that political parties, political leaders often launch their campaigns on the banks of the river and promise they're going to clean it up, right? So they deliver just like politicians do all over the world, right? So in that sense, there's the use of the Ganges. Allahabad is kind of an interesting, now called Prayagraj, renamed. Prayagraj just refers to that it's a pilgrimage, the king of the pilgrimage towns, is a place where a very secular-minded political leader came from, Nehru. And Nehru, who was never known for his religiosity, probably reflected the views of most Indians. He said when he died, he wanted part of him interred in the waters of the Ganges. So he thought very lovingly of this river that he had grown up next to by virtue of being a citizen of Allahabad.
Thanks. We probably have time for one or two more questions. There's a question asking if you have any recommendations for books, either on the Ganges itself and its history, or on colonial India more broadly that might also mention the Ganges.
Yeah, there's a book written by Sen called, Sudipta Sen called, what is it, Many Lives, is it Lives or The Many Paths of an Indian River. Ganges, the Many Paths of an Indian River. I think that's well worth reading. That's fairly recent. The Ganges has endless numbers of books written about it. Many of them, if you don't want to read academic prose, written by journalists. And some of them are quite wonderful. And the illustrated accounts of the Ganges, where photographers have followed it every step of the way up into the glaciers, many of them are excellent books. I would be happy if you emailed me. I can tell you about other titles.
Thank you. Can you also speak a little bit to what grew along the Ganges? What kinds of crops? What kinds of things that were taken around the world? Was it famous for any particular kind of crop, just along the Ganges, whichever part of it?
Yeah, the crops weren't exported so much, but the Ganges was used as a conduit to export from India to all over Southeast Asia. And so boats that plied the Ganges would eventually head out to sea, and there, if they went to the Indus area, go into the Arabian Sea and ship goods all across the Middle East, or if they went into the Bay of Bengal, they would also eventually enter the South China Seas. So trade between all of East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and India took place. The kinds of things India would produce. They ranged from precious stones to jewelry to, of course, textiles. Most of the world's textiles before a certain time is produced in India. The kinds of crops that are grown, what enables the Ganges to be such a productive area, the Gangetic Plain, is rice cultivation. And it's this intensive wet rice cultivation that produces much higher yields than wheat, that enables this huge population to thrive in this area. So if you look at the province of Uttar Pradesh today, so one province, 250 million people live there. Province of Bihar, now cut off from its southern part, which is yet another province. Bihar is a little over 100 million people. Bengal, part of that Bengal that the British first got, another 40 or 50 million people. Bangladesh, which was also part of this greater Bengal, 170 million people. The southern part of Bihar, which is its own state now, 40 to 50 million people. So these are all the people, 400 million people depend on the Gangetic Plain. About 9% of the world's population lives in the Indo-Gangetic plains. So in the plains of the Indus River and in the plains of the Ganges River. The reason they do is the agricultural system can support them, but increasingly it's much more precarious. Monsoons are shorter, monsoons are unpredictable. The glaciers, as you saw in the image of the Gangotri Glacier, has been shrinking. The rains are no longer as intense or sometimes overly heavy, leading to the kinds of floods we've had in recent years. There are dams that have been erected in the higher reaches of all these rivers. So it's not just about the pollution, it's what's happening to the water of the river itself that threatens its future.
Thank you so much. And we did not even get to what happens when India and Bangladesh, how do they share the Ganges? But that is all we have time for. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here. And let's give our speaker a final round of applause.
Thank you
so much, Anand.